At my granddaughter's wedding, I once noticed my name tag said something humiliating. But nothing prepared me for what happened on my 40th wedding anniversary. That morning, my husband filed for divorce. On our anniversary. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I simply looked at the date on the court document, then back at him, and said, I see. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I never imagined that the day I once called the happiest of my life would become the day my marriage quietly collapsed. 40 years. 40 years of shared mortgages, shared winters, shared Sunday mornings with coffee and the newspaper spread across the kitchen table. 40 years of building a life brick by brick in a modest 2-story house outside Columbus, Ohio. That morning began like any other anniversary. I woke before sunrise, the way I always do. Habit, I suppose. At 68, your body doesn't wait for alarms anymore. The bedroom was still dim, pale winter light slipping through the curtains. I reached across the bed, expecting to feel him there. The space was empty. His side of the bed was cold. I told myself he must have gone downstairs early. He'd been restless for months. Work stress, he said, market fluctuations, new investments. I put on my robe and walked slowly down the hallway, my slippers brushing against the hardwood floors we'd refinished together 10 years ago. The house was quiet. Too quiet. No coffee brewing. No radio humming softly in the kitchen. Only silence. On the dining table, I had already set aside the card I bought him 2 days earlier. A simple navy envelope. Inside, I had written, 40 years, I would choose you again. I ran my fingers over the ink for a moment before setting it back down. He had left before I woke up. That wasn't entirely unusual, but on our anniversary, it felt deliberate. I made myself breakfast, 1 slice of toast, half a grapefruit, black coffee. I remember staring at the steam rising from the mug and thinking how strange it was that 40 years could feel so small in a single morning. At around 10:30, there was a knock at the door. Not the soft, familiar knock of a neighbor. A firm, professional knock. I opened the door to find a man in a gray suit holding a manila envelope. Mrs. Harper? He asked. Yes. You've been served. The words were calm, polite, clinical. He handed me the envelope as if it were a utility bill. I stood there for a moment, the winter air brushing against my face, before closing the door. I didn't rush to open it. Instead, I placed it neatly on the kitchen counter and finished my coffee. Then I washed my mug. Then I wiped down the counter. Only after everything was clean did I sit down and slide my finger under the flap. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Filed that morning. By my husband. The date at the top read clearly. January 14th. Our anniversary. I looked at the line where he had signed his name. The same signature I had seen on birthday cards. On mortgage papers. On Christmas checks to our grandchildren. Steady, confident, familiar. I didn't feel anger at first. I felt something colder. Precision. This wasn't impulsive. This was planned. My phone buzzed shortly after. A text from him. We need to talk. I'll meet you at Reynolds and Clay at 2 p.m. Not, I'm sorry. Not, please understand. Just logistics. Reynolds and Clay was a downtown law firm. Marble lobby, tall windows, the kind of place that smells faintly of leather and polished wood. By the time I drove there, the winter sky had turned overcast. I parked carefully, as I always do, straight between the lines. Inside the conference room, he was already seated. Across from him sat a younger woman in a navy suit. His attorney, I assumed. He looked composed. Almost relieved. Margaret, he said, as if we were discussing a dinner reservation instead of dismantling 4 decades of marriage. I took the seat opposite him. Folded my hands in my lap. Listened. He spoke about irreconcilable differences. About wanting a fresh start. About finding himself again. I noticed he avoided eye contact when he mentioned finances. The attorney slid a folder toward me. Proposed division of assets. The numbers were selective. Accounts missing. Properties unmentioned. I recognized the tone. Not regret. Confidence. He believed I would accept it quietly. That I would be overwhelmed. That I would simply sign and retreat into some smaller life. I closed the folder. Looked at him carefully. 40 years. I remembered the day we moved into our first apartment. The furniture we bought secondhand. The nights we stayed up planning how to afford our first home. I remembered holding his hand when he lost his father. I remembered defending him when others doubted his business ideas. And now he sat across from me like I was a chapter he had already finished reading. You chose today, I said calmly. He hesitated. It was available, he replied. Available. As if our anniversary were a time slot on a calendar. I nodded slowly. I see. The attorney began outlining timelines, court dates, mediation possibilities. I didn't interrupt. I didn't accuse. I didn't ask about another woman. Because something told me this wasn't just about a woman. This was about something larger. More structured. More calculated. When the meeting ended, he stood first. For what it's worth, he said, this is for the best. I held his gaze for a long moment. Then I smiled. Not warmly. Not bitterly. Just knowingly. I suppose we'll see, I said. As I walked out of that building, the cold air hit my face again. But I didn't feel shattered. I felt alert. 40 years teaches you patterns. And this pattern didn't begin today. It began months ago. Maybe years. He thought he was ending something quietly. What he didn't realize was that filing those papers on our anniversary was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of his exposure. And I let him believe I was broken. That was his first mistake. I drove home in silence. No radio. No phone calls. I stopped at the familiar red light on Maple Street. The same corner where we used to watch fireworks every 4th of July. He once held my hand there and told me we had come a long way. Now I sat at that same light alone. The house looked exactly the same when I pulled into the driveway. White shutters, the maple tree in the front yard, the mailbox he installed himself 20 years ago. Nothing about it suggested that 40 years had just been erased. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The faint scent of wood polish and lavender cleaner lingered in the air. I placed my purse on the console table, hung my coat on the hook like I always did. Everything was tidy. Too tidy. I walked straight to our bedroom. His dresser drawer was half empty. A few dress shirts were gone. 2 pairs of shoes missing from their usual spot. But not everything. He hadn't left in a rush. He had left in stages. I sat down on the edge of the bed where I put on my shoes every morning. People imagine the end of a marriage comes with shouting, slammed doors, tears. It doesn't always. Sometimes it comes with silence. And silence makes a house feel heavier than any argument ever could. I opened the closet and looked at the suits still hanging there. We bought those together. I helped him choose ties before important meetings. Once, years ago, he said, "You're the only one who really understands me." I didn't feel rage. I felt curiosity. Because something didn't fit. If this was just about wanting a fresh start, he could have left honestly. Instead, he chose our anniversary. He chose to retain an attorney before telling me. He chose a financial proposal that benefited him. That wasn't emotion. That was structure. I walked to the small office at the end of the hallway. The oak desk where I had managed household bills for decades was still there. Organized, labeled, familiar. I turned on the lamp. Opened the drawer. Pulled out old financial files. I may not have run his company, but I always knew where the money moved. That was our agreement. Transparency. At least, I believed it was. I opened my laptop. Logged into our joint bank account. The password still worked. But the balance was lower than I remembered. Not drained. Just lower. I scanned the last 6 months of transactions. There were recurring transfers. Clean, round numbers. Sent on the 15th of every month. Not to my account. Not to the main business account. To another account. The recipient listed only an initial. I didn't panic. I printed the statements. Stacked them neatly on the desk. Then I pulled last year's tax return. There was a deduction I didn't remember discussing. An additional property listed in the asset summary. An address. Not in Columbus. In Cincinnati. Almost 2 hours away. I leaned back in my chair. Cincinnati. He had business trips there. I remember asking once, "Do you want me to come along?" He smiled and said, "It's just a quick meeting." A quick meeting. I didn't cry. I didn't throw the papers across the room. I sorted them. Apartment. Monthly transfers. Divorce filed in advance. Anniversary chosen deliberately. This wasn't impulsive. This was strategic. I walked into the kitchen. Opened the refrigerator. The anniversary dinner I had prepared earlier was still there. The marinated steak. The bottle of red wine waiting to be opened. I closed the door. There was no reason to cook. I sat at the dining table. The card I had written that morning was still there. 40 years, I would choose you again. I turned it face down. Not torn. Not thrown away. Just turned over. That night, I didn't call our children. They would find out soon enough. But before I spoke to anyone, I needed the full truth. I returned to the office. Opened the laptop again. This time, I searched deeper into business filings and property records. If there was an apartment. If there was a separate account. If there were scheduled transfers. Then there might be more. I glanced at the clock. 9:07 p.m. 40 years ago at this exact hour. We were dancing at our wedding reception. Tonight, I was sitting alone with financial statements spread across a desk. Life doesn't always fall apart with a loud crash. Sometimes it unravels in numbers. I leaned back and took a slow breath. If he believed I would sign those papers in shock, then he had forgotten something important. I can be silent. But I have never been unprepared. And if there is a second life he built without me, I will find it. Piece by piece. The next morning, I woke up at the same hour I always do. 5:42 a.m. Habit is a strange thing. It continues even when everything else stops. The house was quiet again. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the absence of his breathing beside me. 40 years of waking up next to someone, and now there was only stillness. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't check messages. Instead, I got up, made coffee, and brought it into the office. The stack of papers from the night before was exactly where I had left it. Neat, ordered, waiting. I opened my laptop and typed in the Cincinnati address from the tax return. The property came up almost immediately. A condominium unit. Purchased 3 years ago. 3 years. My mind moved slowly through the timeline. 3 years ago was when he started traveling more frequently. 3 years ago was when he began saying he needed space to think. 3 years ago was when our anniversary dinners became shorter. I clicked through the public property records. The owner listed wasn't just his name. It was a limited liability company. The company name meant nothing to me. But when I searched it, I found the registration. He was the registered agent. Filed the paperwork himself. Careful. Layered. Intentional. I leaned back in my chair. This wasn't a sudden emotional decision. This was construction. A second structure built quietly alongside the first. I printed the property record and placed it on top of the bank statements. Then I opened our joint credit card history. There were hotel charges in Cincinnati at first. Then fewer hotel charges. Then none at all. Because he didn't need hotels anymore. I noticed something else. A furniture store. High-end. Multiple purchases over the last 2 years. Delivery address, Cincinnati. Sofas. Dining table. Bedroom set. Not just an apartment. A home. I stared at the itemized list for a long time. There is something unsettling about seeing proof in black and white. It removes imagination, replaces it with fact. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was mapping patterns, dates, connections. Then I saw it. A payment to a private elementary school in Cincinnati. Quarterly tuition. I froze. Not because I was surprised, but because it confirmed something I had already suspected. A second life doesn't exist without reason. An apartment is one thing. Furniture is another. School tuition is something else entirely. I closed my eyes briefly. 40 years of marriage. And somewhere, in another city, there may have been a child walking into a classroom funded by my husband's business trips. I didn't allow myself to spiral. Instead, I opened a new folder on my desktop. I named it simply, documentation. Every file went into it. Bank statements, property records, corporate registration, credit card history. If this was going to be handled in court, it would be handled properly. Around 8:30 a.m., my phone rang. It was him. I let it ring twice before answering. "Margaret," he said. His voice was steady, almost casual. "Have you had a chance to review the proposal?" "Yes," I replied. A pause. "And?" "I'm reviewing everything carefully." Another pause. "I think it would be better if we keep this amicable," he said. "There's no need to make things complicated." Complicated. I glanced at the printed property record on my desk. The apartment. The LLC. The school tuition. "It already is complicated," I said quietly. He exhaled. "Let's not drag this out." I almost smiled. 3 years of planning. And now he didn't want it dragged out. "I'll be in touch through counsel," I said. I ended the call before he could respond. My hands were steady when I placed the phone down. That steadiness surprised me. You would think discovering something like this would break a person. But what breaks you is confusion. Clarity does something different. Clarity sharpens. By mid-morning, I had contacted a forensic accountant recommended by a friend years ago. I never thought I would need that number. But I kept it. I scheduled a consultation. Then I called a divorce attorney of my own. Not someone recommended by him. Not someone in his network. Someone independent. Someone thorough. I gave only minimal details over the phone. "We may be dealing with undisclosed assets," I said. The receptionist didn't sound surprised. That, too, told me something. After I hung up, I walked into the living room. Sunlight filtered through the blinds. The wedding photo still hung above the fireplace. We looked young. Certain. Unaware. I studied that photograph for a long time. Then I took it down. Not smashed. Not thrown away. Just removed from the wall. I placed it carefully in a drawer. Because whatever this was, it wasn't just about betrayal. It was about underestimation. He believed I wouldn't look. He believed I wouldn't notice missing pieces. He believed that age equals passivity. He forgot something important. I managed our household for 4 decades. I balanced budgets. Negotiated mortgages. Reviewed contracts. I may not have built his company. But I helped build the foundation that allowed him to. If there is a second life in Cincinnati. If there is a child. If there is another family. Then the court will see it. Not because I scream. Not because I accuse. But because I document. Piece by piece. And this time, I am not turning the card face down. I am turning the page. That afternoon, I drove to Cincinnati. Not in a rush. Not dramatically. Just deliberately. 2 hours is long enough to think. But not long enough to unravel. The highway stretched ahead of me in long gray lines. Winter trees bare on either side. I kept the radio off again. I wanted clarity. The address from the property record led me to a quiet condominium complex on the edge of the city. Brick buildings, clean sidewalks, a small playground near the entrance. A playground. I parked across the street. I didn't step out immediately. I watched. People came and went. A woman pushing a stroller. A man carrying groceries. A child riding a scooter in slow circles near the curb. Ordinary. Normal. That was what unsettled me most. The unit number listed in the records was on the second floor of Building C. Balcony facing east. White curtains drawn halfway across the glass doors. I didn't walk up to the door. I didn't knock. This wasn't about confrontation. This was about confirmation. After a few minutes, a silver sedan pulled into the parking lot. I recognized it immediately. His car. He stepped out wearing the navy overcoat I bought him last Christmas. He looked comfortable. Not rushed. Not guilty. He unlocked the building door with a key. A key. Not a visitor's code. Not a temporary pass. A key. I sat there, hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, and watched him disappear inside. No tears came. What I felt instead was alignment. The pieces fitting together exactly as they should. 3 years. 3 years of extended meetings. 3 years of coming home later on Thursdays. 3 years of being slightly distracted during dinner. I remembered something small. The way he started taking phone calls outside. Even in winter. Standing on the porch with his coat half-buttoned. Saying it was about quarterly reports. I remembered the shift in anniversaries. No more reservations weeks in advance. No more flowers waiting on the kitchen counter. Just simple dinners. Then shorter dinners. Then, rain checks. I remembered how he once insisted we refinance the house to optimize our portfolio. At the time, it sounded responsible. Now, it sounded strategic. I stayed parked for nearly 20 minutes. At one point, the balcony door opened. A little girl stepped outside. Maybe 7 or 8 years old. Dark hair. She leaned over the railing and waved at someone below. A moment later, he appeared behind her. He rested his hand lightly on her shoulder. Protective. Familiar. Practiced. My chest tightened, but I didn't break. I didn't need to. I had already seen enough. I drove back to Columbus before sunset. The sky turned pale pink as the highway curved north. 40 years of marriage. And somewhere in the middle of it, another life had taken root. That night, I sat at the kitchen table again. Not with confusion. With precision. I added new notes to my documentation folder. Observed date and time. Vehicle confirmation. Child approximately elementary school age. Physical presence consistent with residence. I wrote it like a report. Because that's what it would become. Evidence. Around 8 p.m., he texted. Running late tonight, don't wait up. I looked at the message for a long moment. Then I typed back. Drive safely. That was all. He didn't know I had seen him. He didn't know I had been sitting across the street. He believed the distance between us was emotional. He didn't realize it was geographical. Measured in miles. In property deeds. In tuition payments. When he finally came home that night, it was close to midnight. I was in the living room reading. The lamp beside me casting a soft glow. He walked in quietly. Hung his coat. Avoided my eyes. Long day, he said. I'm sure, I replied. He went upstairs. The sound of the shower turned on. Water running. Routine. I closed my book. Followed him up a few minutes later. His phone was on the nightstand. Face down. He had always believed I would never look. He was right. I didn't look. Because I no longer needed to. The evidence was no longer in messages. It was in deeds. In bank transfers. In a little girl leaning over a balcony railing. I lay down on my side of the bed. He slid in beside me after his shower. The space between us felt wider than the highway to Cincinnati. He thought this would end quietly. He thought I would accept a neat division of assets and retreat. What he didn't understand is that quiet does not mean unaware. Silence does not mean surrender. And I have never been someone who signs a document without reading every line. If there is another family. If there is a child. If there is money diverted over years. Then the court will see it. Not because I shout. Not because I expose him publicly, but because facts have weight. And I am done carrying the weight alone. This isn't about revenge. It's about correction. And correction begins with truth. Piece by piece. The following week, I met with the forensic accountant. His office was smaller than I expected. No dramatic walls of certificates. Just a quiet man in his early 50s with wireframe glasses and a legal pad in front of him. I handed him the folder. Bank statements, property records, corporate filings, tuition payments. He didn't interrupt while I spoke. He didn't react dramatically. He simply nodded and began flipping through the documents. "How long have you been married?" he asked. 40 years. "And when did the transfers begin?" 3 years ago. He made a note. That timing matters. Timing. It always does. Over the next hour, he pointed out what I had already begun to suspect. The LLC in Cincinnati wasn't just holding property. It was structured to shield income. There were layered transfers, business revenue routed into the LLC, then partially distributed elsewhere. Not illegal on its own, but problematic if undisclosed during divorce proceedings, especially in a long-term marriage. "Has he filed his full financial disclosure yet?" he asked. "Yes." "And does it list this property?" "No." He leaned back slightly. "That omission is significant." Significant. Such a clean word for something so deliberate. By the time I left his office, I had a clearer picture. The apartment wasn't just a retreat. It was funded, maintained, integrated into his financial system. This wasn't a temporary affair. It was infrastructure. That evening, my attorney called. "I've reviewed the initial filing," she said. Her voice was steady, precise. "He's presenting this as a straightforward dissolution with equitable division." I almost smiled. Equitable. As long as full disclosure is provided. She continued. "That would be the expectation." "And if it's not?" I asked. "Then the court takes that very seriously." I didn't need elaboration. I understood leverage. Later that night, he sat across from me at the kitchen table. The same table where we had celebrated birthdays. Discussed college plans. Planned retirement. He cleared his throat. "I think we should keep this civil, Margaret." "It already is," I said. He shifted in his chair. "There's no need to bring unnecessary scrutiny into this." "Unnecessary." I folded my hands calmly. "Transparency isn't scrutiny," I replied. For a moment, his expression changed. Just slightly. A flicker. Not fear, but awareness. "You've always trusted me," he said quietly. "Yes," I answered. Past tense. He noticed. I saw it in the way his jaw tightened. "I don't want this to become hostile," he added. "Neither do I. But hostility and accountability are not the same thing." The next morning, my attorney filed a motion requesting expanded financial disclosure, including any business entities formed within the last 5 years, including any real property acquired outside the county, including all educational payments made on behalf of dependents. The language was neutral, professional, comprehensive. By late afternoon, he called again. This time, his voice was different. "What exactly are you implying?" he asked. "I'm not implying anything," I said calmly. "I'm requesting clarity." A long silence followed. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "No. I was making it accurate." That evening, I walked through the house slowly. The living room. The hallway. The bedroom. 40 years of shared space. 40 years of believing I was in a partnership. I paused in front of the mirror in our bedroom. I studied my reflection. Silver hair, steady eyes, lines earned honestly. He may have built another life quietly. But I built resilience. And resilience doesn't collapse under documentation. A few days later, his attorney responded. There was hesitation in the wording. A request for additional time. A clarification regarding business holdings. That phrase again. Business holdings. As if Cincinnati were merely an investment. As if a child's tuition were a ledger entry. My attorney called me as soon as she received it. They're adjusting their position, she said. Of course they are. Because concealment works best when it remains unseen. The moment light touches it, structure shifts. That night, he didn't come home until after midnight again. I didn't ask where he had been. He didn't volunteer. But something had changed. He moved through the house differently. More aware. More cautious. He knew the process was no longer simple. He knew I was not going to sign quietly. He just didn't know how much I already knew. And that uncertainty was new for him. For 3 years, he controlled the narrative. The travel. The accounts. The explanations. Now the narrative required documentation. And documentation does not bend to convenience. This isn't about humiliation. It isn't about drama. It's about fairness. 40 years of shared assets. 40 years of shared risk. If there was another household built in parallel, then it was funded during this marriage. And that matters. The court will decide outcomes. But facts decide direction. And facts are no longer on his side. He believed I would react emotionally. Instead, I responded structurally. He believed silence meant surrender. Instead, silence gave me space to calculate. 3 years of hidden transfers. 1 concealed property. Quarterly tuition. Layered business entities. Piece by piece, the second life was no longer invisible. And once something becomes visible, it cannot return to shadow. 2 weeks later, the formal discovery process began. The word sounds harmless. Discovery. As if we were uncovering something academic. But in divorce proceedings, discovery is exposure. My attorney explained it carefully. They are required to provide complete financial documentation. Business interests, real estate, dependent expenses, everything. Everything. That word held weight. The first response from his legal team arrived on a Thursday afternoon. A thick envelope. Certified mail. I placed it on the kitchen counter the same way I had placed the divorce papers weeks earlier. Calmly. Deliberately. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I poured myself a cup of tea. Sat down. Waited until my hands were steady. Then I began reading. There it was. The Cincinnati condominium. Listed under the LLC. Presented as an investment property. No mention of personal use. No mention of residency. No mention of tuition. Just a line item. Sanitized. Contained. He was adjusting his narrative. I continued reading. There were additional financial disclosures. Investment accounts I had never seen. Retirement reallocations. Insurance policy amendments. One detail made me pause. A life insurance beneficiary update. Filed 18 months ago. The primary beneficiary had changed. It was no longer me. The name listed wasn't familiar. Just an initial and a last name. I recognized the last name. It matched the registration on the Cincinnati property utilities. The room felt smaller for a moment. Not because I was shocked. But because the pattern was now complete. Property. Tuition. Beneficiary. He hadn't simply created distance. He had transferred priority. That evening, he came home earlier than usual. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen while I reviewed the documents again. I assume you've received the updated disclosures, he said. Yes. They clarify things. Some things, I replied. He walked closer, resting his hand on the back of a chair. I didn't hide anything, he said. I looked up at him. You structured it, I answered. He didn't deny that. Instead, he shifted. It's just business. Cincinnati. A furnished apartment. Quarterly tuition. An updated beneficiary. Just business. You've always trusted my judgment, he added. Again, past tense hiding inside present language. Trust is not retroactive. It's not about judgment, I said quietly. It's about disclosure. He exhaled slowly. You're making assumptions. No. I was reading documents. There's a difference. The next morning, my attorney filed a supplemental request. Occupancy records for the condominium. Utility usage history. Educational enrollment verification tied to any financial contribution. Her tone was measured. Professional. Firm. When she called to confirm submission, she said something I hadn't expected. They're unsettled. Why? I asked. Because this was supposed to be simple. Simple. A long-term wife, nearing 70, likely to settle quietly. That was the assumption. But assumptions collapse when documentation appears. 3 days later, we received additional records. Utility bills. Water usage consistent with full-time occupancy. Electricity spikes in the evenings. A cable subscription registered under the same LLC. Not an investment. A residence. There was also confirmation from the school. A child enrolled under the same last name. Emergency contact listed as him. I read that line twice. Emergency contact. Father. The word didn't blur. It didn't distort. It sat there plainly. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair. 40 years of marriage. And somewhere within those years, he had signed another form. Another birth certificate. Another emergency contact line. He came home late again that night. But something in him had shifted. He was quieter. Measured. Careful with his movements. He knew more information had surfaced. He just didn't know how much I had already seen. He poured himself a drink and stood at the kitchen counter. This doesn't need to get ugly, he said. It isn't ugly, I replied. It's factual. He looked at me differently then. Not as a wife. Not as someone emotional. But as someone procedural. And that unsettled him more. He believed emotion would cloud my actions. Instead, clarity guided them. He believed age meant fatigue. Instead, it meant patience. He believed silence meant surrender. Instead, it meant preparation. Later that night, I walked through the house again. The hallway photographs. Family vacations. Graduations. Christmas mornings. Every image told a story of one life. But there had been another story running parallel. Not visible. Not acknowledged. But funded. And that funding matters. In long-term marriages, courts consider contribution. Time. Sacrifice. Shared growth. If marital assets funded another household, that is not a private matter. That is material. I sat back down at my desk and updated the folder again. Property confirmed as residence. Child confirmed. Beneficiary confirmed. 3 confirmations. 3 pillars of a second life. The court date was approaching. He believed we were negotiating numbers. What we were actually negotiating was truth. And truth has structure. Once it is documented, it does not retreat. This isn't about revenge. It isn't about humiliation. It's about correction. He adjusted his life quietly. Now the record is adjusting publicly. And the record doesn't forget. The first court appearance was procedural. That's what my attorney called it. Procedural. As if it were routine. As if 40 years could be summarized in a docket number. The courthouse in downtown Columbus felt colder than the weather outside. Gray stone, high ceilings, rows of wooden benches polished by decades of waiting. He arrived before I did. Standing near his attorney. Composed. Well-dressed. Controlled. He nodded when he saw me. Not warmly. Not unkindly. Just formally. I returned the nod. We no longer looked like a couple. We looked like opposing parties. Inside the courtroom, everything moved efficiently. Names called. Files passed forward. No raised voices. No dramatic accusations. Just paperwork and posture. When our case was called, we stood side by side, but not together. The judge reviewed the initial filings. Reviewed the supplemental discovery requests. Then paused. There appears to be a discrepancy between initial disclosures and subsequent documentation, she said. Her tone wasn't emotional. It didn't need to be. Discrepancy. That word echoed more loudly than any accusation. His attorney stepped forward. There were updates provided as additional information became available. Additional information. As if the Cincinnati property had materialized overnight. As if the child had just appeared in the system last week. The judge looked down at the paperwork again. And the beneficiary change on the life insurance policy? Silence. His attorney adjusted her glasses. That was a personal decision unrelated to marital asset division. Unrelated. Nothing is unrelated when it intersects with shared finances. The judge didn't respond immediately. Instead, she made a note. A small movement of her pen. But it carried weight. She then addressed both of us. In long-term marriages, transparency is not optional. It is expected. Expected. I kept my eyes forward. Didn't glance at him. Didn't react. Because reaction wasn't necessary. The record was speaking. When we stepped outside the courtroom for a short recess, he approached me. His voice was lower now. Is this really necessary? Yes, I said. You could have come to me. I did, I replied quietly, for 40 years. He didn't answer that. Instead, he exhaled sharply. You're making this harder. Harder. Truth is only difficult when it's inconvenient. We returned to the courtroom. The judge ordered a full forensic accounting review. Formal. Court supervised. Deadlines established. Documentation required. This was no longer a negotiation between two private individuals. It was a structured examination. And structure does not favor concealment. When the hearing concluded, I walked out without speaking to him again. Outside, the air was sharp. Winter sun low against the courthouse steps. Reporters weren't there. This wasn't that kind of case. But it didn't need an audience. Accountability doesn't require headlines. In the days that followed, more records surfaced. Transfers from business revenue to the LLC. Maintenance payments tied directly to marital funds. Insurance premiums covering a secondary residence. And then the final confirmation. The birth certificate. Filed 8 years ago. Father listed. His name. 8 years. Which meant he had built another family while still attending our daughter's college graduation. While still celebrating Christmas at our table. While still telling me he was working late. 8 years is not a mistake. 8 years is a commitment. I sat at my desk reading that document. No tears. No shaking hands. Just stillness. Because clarity removes illusion. That evening, he didn't come home at all. No text. No explanation. The bed remained half untouched. For the first time since this began, the house felt lighter. Not emptier. Lighter. Because uncertainty had weight. And uncertainty was gone. The next court date was scheduled 6 weeks later. By then, the forensic accountant would have completed a full analysis. My attorney explained the implications. Failure to disclose marital assets can significantly impact settlement outcomes. Impact. That word mattered. Not emotionally. Legally. He had assumed I would avoid conflict. Assumed I would choose peace over precision. But peace without truth is simply silence. And I was finished being silent in the wrong direction. This isn't about punishing him. It isn't about destroying his second life. It's about correcting the first one. 40 years of shared income. Shared taxes. Shared growth. If that growth funded another household, then the division must reflect that reality. He believed the divorce filing would give him control. Instead, it triggered review. He believed I would react emotionally. Instead, I responded procedurally. He believed he was closing a chapter. But what he did was open an audit. And audits are thorough. Piece by piece. Line by line. Truth doesn't raise its voice. It documents. And once it's documented, it doesn't disappear. The forensic report was completed 3 weeks before the next hearing. It arrived in a sealed envelope from my attorney's office. Thick. Structured. Final. I didn't open it in the car. I waited until I was home. Sat at the same oak desk. Turned on the same lamp. Then I began reading. The first section outlined asset movement over the last 8 years. Not 3. 8. Revenue streams from his company had steadily increased during that time. But our joint savings had not reflected the same growth. Instead, funds had been redirected. Layered transfers. Strategic allocations. Business expenses that overlapped with personal usage. The Cincinnati condominium was officially categorized as an investment property. But the forensic analysis told a different story. Utility usage consistent with daily occupancy. Groceries purchased locally. Streaming subscriptions tied to that address. Private school tuition linked through verified bank routing numbers. The language in the report was clinical. But the pattern was clear. This wasn't incidental. It was sustained. I turned the page. There it was in a single paragraph. Evidence suggests marital funds were utilized to support a secondary household over an extended period of approximately 8 years. 8 years. Not a lapse. Not a moment of weakness. A parallel life. Funded through the marriage. I leaned back in my chair. The house was quiet again. But this time, the silence felt different. Not heavy. Defined. Later that afternoon, my attorney called. The report is comprehensive, she said. Yes. He's going to have difficulty explaining this. Is that necessary? I asked. It becomes necessary when disclosure is incomplete. Necessary. Another word that carried weight without volume. The next hearing approached quietly. No dramatic confrontations at home. He had been staying in Cincinnati most nights now. The house in Columbus felt like a waiting room. When we entered the courtroom again, there was less confidence in his posture. Subtle. But visible. His attorney requested a private conference before proceedings began. They stepped aside with my attorney. Voices low. Measured. I remained seated. Hands folded. Watching without staring. When we were called forward, the judge reviewed the forensic findings. Her expression did not change. But her questions sharpened. Why was this property not fully disclosed in the initial filing? His attorney responded. It was believed to be a separate business holding. Occupied by whom? The judge asked. Silence. The courtroom was quiet enough to hear paper shift. Finally, his attorney said, the respondent has personal ties to the residence. Personal ties. The judge didn't press emotionally. She pressed structurally. And the tuition payments? They were discretionary. Funded from which accounts? No immediate answer. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. The report had already spoken. The judge made another note. Then another. These findings will factor into equitable distribution, she said. Equitable. The word returned. But this time, it carried recalibration. When we stepped outside again, he didn't approach me. He stood a few feet away, speaking urgently with his attorney. His voice was lower than usual. Controlled, but strained. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in him. Not about the divorce. About the exposure. Exposure changes leverage. He had assumed I wouldn't examine the structure. He had assumed longevity meant compliance. He had assumed silence meant surrender. Instead, silence created space. Space to collect. To verify. To confirm. That evening, I walked through the Columbus house again. But this time, I wasn't counting memories. I was assessing value. The equity. The retirement accounts. The investments built during our marriage. 40 years of shared contribution. If those contributions funded a second household, then the adjustment would reflect that. Not emotionally. Mathematically. He texted later that night. We need to talk. I waited a few minutes before replying. We will, through counsel. That wasn't distance. That was boundary. The following morning, my attorney informed me of something else. They're proposing mediation before the next hearing. Mediation. Another word that suggests calm resolution. Why now? I asked. Because the findings changed the landscape. Yes. They did. This isn't about humiliation. It isn't about revenge. It's about correction. For 8 years, resources were divided without acknowledgement. For 8 years, a second structure stood quietly beside the first. Now the record reflects both. And once the record reflects it, it becomes part of the equation. He thought filing for divorce on our anniversary would give him control. Instead, it triggered review. Review led to audit. Audit led to adjustment. And adjustment is rarely comfortable. But it is necessary. Truth doesn't argue. It accumulates. And once it accumulates enough weight, it shifts the balance. Line by line. Account by account. Until the story is no longer his alone. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. Neutral office. Long rectangular table. No raised voices. No audience. Just attorneys, documentation, and time. He arrived early. Again. But this time, he didn't look composed. He looked calculated. There's a difference. Calculated means preparing for negotiation. Composed means confident in outcome. He was no longer confident. We sat across from each other. The mediator, a middle-aged woman with calm eyes and a legal pad, outlined the process. This is an opportunity to resolve matters privately, she said, before further court intervention. Privately. Interesting word. For 8 years, privacy had worked in his favor. Now it required transparency. His attorney began with a revised proposal. Increased spousal support. Adjusted division of retirement accounts. Recognition of the Cincinnati property as marital assets subject to distribution. Carefully worded. Strategically softened. I listened without interrupting. When they finished, the mediator turned to me. Mrs. Harper? I folded my hands. There are still discrepancies, I said. He shifted in his chair. What discrepancies? He asked. I met his eyes for the first time that morning. The trust account. He froze. Just slightly. My attorney slid another document across the table. A supplemental forensic finding. There had been an additional account. Opened under the LLC. Not previously disclosed. Funds transferred from business profit distributions. Not massive. But consistent. Quarterly. For 6 years. He leaned back. That's operational capital, he said quickly. For what operation? I asked calmly. Silence. The mediator looked between us. This account was not included in the original disclosure, my attorney said, nor in the amended submission. His attorney began flipping through papers. I'll need to review this. You've had 3 weeks, my attorney replied evenly. 3 weeks. 3 hearings. 3 disclosures. Each one revealing more than the last. The mediator cleared her throat gently. Mr. Harper, is there any additional financial structure we should be aware of before proceeding? That question hung in the air. Not accusatory. Just direct. He looked at me. And for the first time since this began, I saw something break in his expression. Not anger. Not shame. Fatigue. Because maintaining 2 realities requires energy. And energy runs out under scrutiny. There are no additional properties, he said carefully. Properties. He chose that word intentionally. The mediator nodded. And accounts? A pause. Then. There is a college savings account, he said quietly. For the child. He hadn't planned to mention it. It was visible in the shift of his posture. My attorney wrote it down immediately. Under which name? She asked. He answered. The same last name listed on the birth certificate. The room was still. The mediator made another note. This wasn't emotional. This was structural collapse. Every concealed layer required another admission. Every admission adjusted distribution. Every adjustment shifted leverage. After 2 hours, we took a short break. He approached me near the window. His voice was lower than before. This doesn't need to go further. It already has, I said. You're going to take everything. No, I replied. I'm going to take what reflects 40 years. He looked out at the parking lot. I didn't mean for it to become this. 8 years. 2 households. Multiple accounts. Beneficiary changes. College savings. None of that happens accidentally. You meant for it to stay invisible, I said quietly. He didn't respond. When mediation resumed, the revised settlement terms changed again. Significantly. Increased division of business assets. Transfer of full ownership of the Columbus house to me. Long-term spousal maintenance. Allocation adjustments tied directly to undisclosed transfers. The mediator looked at me. Would you like time to consider? I shook my head slowly. I'll review it formally with counsel. Calm. Measured. Not reactive. Because this was never about reaction. It was about correction. As we left the building, he walked beside me to the parking lot. For a moment, it felt almost familiar. 2 people walking together after a long meeting. Except we were no longer partners. We were parties to a recalibration. I never thought you'd fight this, he said. I'm not fighting, I replied. I'm accounting. He stopped walking for a moment. That word landed. Accounting. Because that is what this has always been. Not revenge. Not drama. Accounting. 40 years of shared labor. Shared compromise. Shared financial growth. If part of that growth funded another life, then the numbers must adjust. Not emotionally. Precisely. He believed filing for divorce on our anniversary would allow him to exit quietly. Instead, it initiated review. Review led to audit. Audit led to admission. And admission leads to redistribution. Piece by piece. Line by line. The second life he built in shadow is now documented in daylight. And daylight changes everything. The final hearing was scheduled for early spring. The snow had melted. The air outside the courthouse felt lighter. Inside, nothing felt light. We sat at separate tables now. No attempt at civility beyond necessity. No quiet conversations near windows. Just documentation stacked neatly in folders. The forensic report had been entered into record. The supplemental disclosures. The trust account. The college savings fund. The beneficiary change. All of it was no longer private. It was procedural. The judge began by summarizing the findings. Her voice steady. Measured. In a marriage of this duration, she said, the expectation of full transparency is not optional. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't accuse. She stated. And statements, in court, carry weight. She reviewed the timeline. 8 years of parallel financial movement. Marital funds used to sustain an undisclosed residence. Additional accounts omitted from initial filing. Amended disclosures submitted only after formal request. Then she paused. Failure to disclose material assets in divorce proceedings undermines equitable distribution. Undermines. That word settled over the room like gravity. His attorney attempted one final clarification. There was no intent to deceive. The judge lifted her hand slightly. Intent is less relevant than accuracy. Silence followed. Because accuracy had already been measured. Line by line. Account by account. She then outlined the ruling. The Columbus house would be transferred fully to me. Business asset division adjusted upward in my favor to reflect redirected marital funds. Retirement accounts recalculated. Long-term spousal maintenance established. And additional financial penalties tied to incomplete disclosure. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. Structured. Corrective. When she finished, she looked at both of us. This court does not punish personal choices, she said. It corrects financial imbalance. That sentence settled everything. This wasn't about morality. It was about math. He sat still. No argument. No objection. Because the numbers had already spoken. Outside the courtroom, the hallway felt different than it had months earlier. Lighter. Not because I felt victorious. But because uncertainty had ended. He approached me once more. Not defensive. Not combative. Just quieter than I had ever seen him. I didn't expect it to go this way, he said. I know, I replied. You could have agreed earlier. I asked for transparency, I said calmly. You gave me fragments. He nodded once. There was no anger left in him. Only recalibration. For the first time, I saw the weight of maintaining two realities. One in Columbus. One in Cincinnati. Now both had been acknowledged. Documented. Adjusted. We walked out of the building separately. I didn't look back. Not because I was bitter. But because closure does not require spectacle. When I returned home that afternoon, the house felt different again. Not like a waiting room. Not like a museum of memory. It felt claimed. The deed would be transferred formally within 30 days. But already, the space felt settled. I walked through each room slowly. The kitchen. The hallway. The living room where our wedding photo had once hung. I opened the drawer and looked at that photograph again. Two young people standing under white lights. Certain. Unaware. I didn't tear it. I didn't hide it. I placed it back inside the drawer. Because that chapter existed. It just no longer defines the whole story. Later that evening, I received the final documentation electronically. Signed. Stamped. Filed. 40 years reduced to pages. But also recalculated. This wasn't about winning. It wasn't about exposing him publicly. It was about correction. For 8 years, marital resources supported another household without disclosure. Now the distribution reflects that reality. That is all. He believed filing for divorce on our anniversary would give him control. Instead, it triggered review. Review led to audit. Audit led to adjustment. And adjustment led to outcome. Calm. Measured. Final. Silence was never weakness. It was space. Space to gather facts. Space to verify truth. Space to respond structurally instead of emotionally. The court did not punish him for having another life. It corrected the imbalance created by hiding it. And correction has a quiet power. When I turned off the lights that night, I felt something unfamiliar. Not relief. Not triumph. Clarity. The second life no longer existed in shadow. It existed in record. And once something is on record, it cannot be erased. Piece by piece. Line by line. The balance has shifted. And this time, it holds. The paperwork was finalized within 30 days. Signatures transferred. Titles reassigned. Accounts recalculated. 40 years reorganized into columns and outcomes. He moved permanently to Cincinnati before the deed transfer was complete. There was no dramatic goodbye. No final argument in the driveway. Just an empty closet. An absence in the garage. A forwarding address filed through his attorney. The Columbus house no longer felt like shared property. It felt defined. Mine. Not as a prize. Not as compensation. As correction. The first weekend after everything was finalized, our daughter came to visit. She had known pieces of the story. Not all of it. I had been careful. Children, even grown ones, carry enough weight of their own. But clarity eventually travels. She sat at the kitchen table where so many conversations had happened before. Her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. Is it true? She asked gently. Yes, I said. All of it? Yes. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She simply nodded. I thought something felt off these last few years, she admitted. Most people do. They just don't always name it. I didn't want to see it, I said. That was the only confession I allowed myself. Because avoidance is quieter than deception. But it is still a choice. Later that week, I received a brief email from him. No greeting beyond my name. I hope we can remain respectful, he wrote. Respect is not declared. It is practiced. I responded simply. I intend to. Nothing more. There was no reason for more. The settlement funds transferred in structured installments. Business equity liquidated in part. Retirement accounts adjusted. Each notification that appeared in my inbox was another confirmation. Not of victory. Of closure. I began reorganizing the house slowly. Not dramatically. Not as if erasing him. Just recalibrating. The office became mine fully. His old filing cabinet emptied. Shredded documents that no longer mattered. Archived those that did. I replaced the locks on the front and back doors. Not out of fear. Out of boundary. One afternoon, I drove past the bank where we had opened our first joint account decades ago. I didn't go inside. I just parked for a moment. 40 years ago, we walked into that building together. Young. Certain. Unaware of what parallel structures might eventually form. But life is not undone by realization. It is redirected by it. The Cincinnati life continues. I don't ask for updates. I don't search online. That chapter is documented. Filed. Closed within my jurisdiction. What he builds there now is not funded by me. That distinction matters. The court did not dissolve memory. It dissolved imbalance. There is a difference. In long marriages, people assume loyalty protects structure. Sometimes structure protects secrecy. And secrecy grows when unexamined. But once examined, it either holds or collapses. His did not hold. And that collapse was not loud. It was procedural. Sometimes people ask if I feel angry. The answer is no. Anger requires heat. What I feel is clarity. Clarity is cooler. Steadier. More durable. I no longer wonder where he is on Thursdays. I no longer question late-night calls. I no longer read between lines. Because there are no hidden lines left. Everything relevant has been recorded. Adjusted. Accounted for. One evening, as I sat in the living room with a book in my lap, I noticed something subtle. The house felt quiet again. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was balanced. Balance is different from peace. Peace can be fragile. Balance is structural. 40 years of shared life cannot be erased. But they can be measured honestly. And honesty has a stabilizing effect. He believed filing for divorce on our anniversary would allow him to exit efficiently. Instead, it initiated review. Review led to audit. Audit led to redistribution. Redistribution led to recalibration. And recalibration led to stability. Not dramatic. Not vindictive. Stable. The second life he built still exists. But it no longer intersects with mine. And that separation is precise. When I turn off the lights now, I don't replay conversations. I don't imagine alternative endings. I understand the ending that occurred. And understanding removes the need for noise. Silence is no longer preparation. It is completion. The imbalance has been corrected. The record has been set. And the life ahead of me is fully accounted for. The anniversary passed again this year. January 14th. For the first time in 41 years, I didn't wake up expecting to share it. I woke up early, as I always do. 5:42 a.m. The house was quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the silence of something collapsing. The quiet of something settled. I made coffee. Walked to the front window. The maple tree in the yard was bare again. Winter returning in its usual rhythm. Time does not pause for personal earthquakes. It continues. Measured. Steady. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I once placed an anniversary card face down. This time, there was no card. No expectation. No waiting. Just morning light stretching slowly across the wood surface. 40 years is not a small thing. It doesn't disappear because paperwork says so. It remains in habits. In recipes memorized. In the way I still fold towels the way he preferred. But what remains is no longer shared. It belongs to memory. And memory, when examined honestly, becomes quieter. I no longer think about Cincinnati with urgency. I don't calculate tuition payments in my head. I don't imagine that balcony. Those pieces have been documented. Adjusted. Closed within my life. Closure is not dramatic. It doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives when your mind stops rehearsing arguments that no longer matter. A few weeks ago, I redecorated the living room. Nothing extravagant. New curtains. A different arrangement of furniture. I hung a landscape painting above the fireplace instead of our wedding photograph. Not because I wanted to erase history, but because history deserves a drawer, not a wall. There is a difference. Our daughter calls more often now. Not to ask questions. Just to talk. About work. About her own children. About ordinary things. Ordinary feels significant. Because for 8 years, ordinary masked something else. Now, ordinary is simply what it appears to be. Last month, I opened a new savings account in my name alone. Not out of fear. Out of recognition. I deposited the first settlement installment. Not as compensation. As recalibration. 40 years of shared structure ended. But the foundation I built remains. I was not removed. I was underestimated. There's a difference. Sometimes people ask if I would have preferred not knowing. If ignorance would have been easier. No. Ignorance extends imbalance. Truth corrects it. Even when truth is quiet. Even when it arrives in the form of spreadsheets and court transcripts. He believed filing for divorce on our anniversary would allow him to begin cleanly. He believed it would be efficient. Neat. Contained. Instead, it revealed the architecture he thought no one would inspect. And once inspected, it could not stand unexamined. I don't hate him. Hatred ties you to what you are trying to leave. What I feel is distance. Measured. Appropriate. He chose another structure. I chose clarity. And clarity, once gained, is permanent. On the evening of that anniversary, I poured a single glass of wine. Not to mourn. Not to celebrate. Just to acknowledge. 40 years happened. They were real. They shaped me. They strengthened me in ways I did not recognize until tested. I raised the glass slightly, not to him. Not to us. To myself. To the woman who did not shout. Did not collapse. Did not sign blindly. To the woman who read every line. Who gathered every record. Who understood that silence can be strategy. And that dignity does not require volume. The house is quiet tonight. Balanced. The deed is in my name. The accounts are structured. The record is clear. He once believed I would accept a fragment of what was built. Instead, I accepted the full truth. And truth carries its own form of peace. If there is one lesson in this story, it is not about betrayal. It is about structure. About reading carefully. About understanding that longevity does not replace vigilance. 40 years is a lifetime. But even a lifetime deserves accuracy. The second life he built still exists somewhere south of here. But it no longer intersects with mine. That is not bitterness. That is boundary. And boundaries are not loud. They are firm. The anniversary used to represent promise. Now it represents clarity. He thought he was ending our story that morning in January. What he actually did was reveal it. And once revealed, it was finally mine to close. Piece by piece. Line by line. The balance holds. And so do I.